Hello, welcome to Bible Guru. Thank you for joining us on our journey through the Bible. Genesis chapter 20. Now, last time we talked about Genesis chapter 19, and we didn't talk about the very ending part of that chapter. The end of chapter 19 is dismal. Lot is saved from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, although Lot's wife didn't make it to the refuge of the hills. Lot's daughters decide that the world has come to an end and that it's up to them to continue the species. So they, on successive nights, get their father drunk and have sex with him to make babies. We'll come back to this. That brings us to Genesis chapter 20. Abraham and Sarah move to Gerar, and Abraham tells his wife to say that she's his sister again. The king of the area, Abimelech, a title which means father king, it's not a name, takes her as his wife, and the king has a dream in which God warns him. So the king calls Abraham and rebukes him and gives him gifts, including about 12 kilos of silver, and tells him to settle down wherever he likes. It's really difficult to read this and not think about Genesis chapter 12. Abraham already went through this, didn't he? At the time, they were not even Abraham and Sarah, they were just Abram and Sarai. Some people who study these passages look at the same story, they look at it as the same story told twice. Let's just talk about that for a minute, because if you read any commentaries from the last few hundred years, they will mention that at some point. The problem with viewing this as just one story is, number one, if you believe that the Bible is God-breathed, as the Bible teaches that it is, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 says all Scripture is inspired by God, then how do you deal with the differences in the narrative? Do you decide that the details are different, but they don't matter? Do you determine that all is God-breathed except for a small portion, some of the small details? I think it's possible to come to this passage with a presupposition of inspiration and to reject the idea that it's one story just based on that alone. In other words, it's two separate events in the life of Abraham, one much earlier when his name was Abram and one that we're studying now. I realize you may not be a person who holds to the view that it is one story that's just told two different places with some small details that are changed. If you do hold to that view, it's difficult to deal with the contradictions created if you decide to look at Abram's trip to Egypt in Genesis chapter 12 as the same story as Abraham's trip to Gerar. A high view of inspiration and a literary view of Genesis chapter 12 and 20 as the same story are difficult, maybe impossible to reconcile. It seems that you'll have to take your pick. Either believe some of the literary critics and their perspective, or believe what the Bible teaches. You can't do both. 2. If you view these stories as one, you disagree with those who originally put these stories together into a cohesive whole. Moses and later editors clearly understood these to be two stories. If you think you know better than they did, I suppose you have a right to your opinion, but I also have a right to not respect your opinion above those who were writing these stories down more than 3,000 years ago. 3. From a literary perspective, we lose the power of the lessons from this narrative if we view chapter 12 and Abram going down to Egypt and chapter 20 and Abram going to Gerar as one story. The fact that Abram and Sarai met with God, received his spirit and direction and blessings, and still found themselves capable of behaving based on lies and fear is a very powerful narrative. And this is the message, I believe, of this chapter. Now, Let's go back to Lot and his daughters. I know that these are two very different stories, yet I feel that they have a unified message for us today. That message is very simple. Even heroes of the faith can be faithless. Lot is often presented as a man who had fleshly decision-making processes, and that's valid. He chose the greener pastures, even though he knew that it would be a land and a territory that was dominated by evil people. For that reason, maybe we would think his horrible circumstances and consequences are to be expected from a biblical perspective. But Lot's daughters' lack of faith and devious actions to avoid a negative, imagined, possible future are very similar to Abraham's. Abraham acknowledged today, 4,000 years after his death, as the father of 3 of Earth's 5 major religions, acknowledged by God as being righteous because he believed, acted in fear, and fear of possible future events. Lot and his daughters, and Abraham and Sarah, are no different from us. Their faith is fleeting. Yet God is faithful, despite his people's erring behavior. He uses the horrible behavior of Lot's daughters to create 2 nations. He uses Abraham and Sarah's misdeeds to settle them in a land with prosperity and provision. He is faithful, even when we are faithless. Many preachers today focus and preach on faith as if it is by our goodness and our faith that we create the good around us. We are simply not the point. God is. He is the one who is good when we are bad, loving when we hate, forgiving when we begrudge, giving when we hoard, and faithful when we are faithless. God bless you. Thanks for watching.